please don't make the same mistake I did. Don't mean that the way it sounds. I'm not talking about an affair or a scandal or some dramatic night that ruins everything. I'm talking about something quieter than that, something that starts with a question you weren't expecting and ends with a version of yourself you didn't know existed, sitting across from you at a kitchen table at 2 in the morning, while your husband sleeps upstairs and the house smells like lavender soap and old Woodium 58. Years old. I've been married to my husband Neil for 34 years. We live in the same house we bought in 1989 in the same neighborhood, where we raised our 2 children who are now grown and living in other states. Neil is not a bad man. I want to say that clearly, and I want to say it first because everything that follows could make you think otherwise, and I don't think that would be fair to him or to me. Neil is steady. Neil is reliable. Neil has never raised his voice at me in 3.5 decades. He mows the lawn on Saturdays, and he takes the car in 4 oil changes without me asking, and he remembers to pay the electric bill, and he goes to work every single day and comes home every single evening and eats whatever I've made for dinner, and then he watches television in the den until he falls asleep in his chair, and then I either wake him up or I don't, and he eventually finds his way to bed. That's my marriage. That's what it has been for a very long time. Not cruel, not loud, not anything, just still the way a pond is still when there's no wind and no fish and no current feeding into it anymore. You look at the surface and it's flat and it's fine and it's not dying exactly, but it's not moving either. I didn't know. I felt that way until someone asked me. Someone was Theo. Theo is the youngest son of Marisol and Ray Donovan. The Donovans have been our friends since before I can properly remember. Ray and Neil worked together at the plant for years, and Marisol and I were in the same women's group at St. Augustine's, and our kids grew up overlapping at birthday parties and soccer games and Christmas Eve services. Theo is 23 years younger than me. I remember him as a baby in a carrier on Marisol's chest at the parish picnic. I remember him at 7 years old, running through my backyard with my son, chasing him with a water gun. I changed that boy's diaper once when Marisol had an emergency, and I was the closest woman with a free lapso. When I say what I'm about to say, I need you to understand that I am not talking about some stranger who walked in and turned my head. I'm talking about someone I've known since before he could talk, someone whose first word I heard, someone I watched grow up and go off to college and come back and start teaching music at the middle school 3 towns over. It was October, a Thursday. I had been to see Dr. Pham about my knee, which has been giving me trouble since I turned 55, and the appointment ran late, and I came out of the medical building and the sky had turned that particular shade of gray that means the weather changed while you were inside and didn't bother to tell you. It wasn't raining yet, but it was about to. You could feel it in the air, that heaviness, that pressure behind your eyesight. Had parked 3 blocks away because the lot was full when I arrived, and now those 3 blocks looked very long, and I was wearing a skirt that would be ruined and shoes that were not made for weather, and I stood under the overhang of the building entrance, and I was trying to decide whether to call Neil or to call a taxi or to just walk and ruin the shoes, when a dark green pickup truck pulled up to the curb and the window came down and a voice said, "Mrs. Caldera." Theo. He leaned across the passenger seat and he was smiling that open, easy smile he's had since he was a boy, and he said, "Hop in. I saw you standing there. You look like you're trying to outrun a storm." I got in. That's the thing. I got in without hesitating, and I want to tell you that I hesitated because it would make me sound more careful, more measured, more like the woman I thought I was, but I didn't. I got in, and the cab was warm, and it smelled like coffee and guitar strings, and he had the radio on low, playing something I didn't recognize, but it had a cello in it, and it was beautiful. He asked me how my knee was. He'd heard through his mother that I'd been having trouble. I said it was fine. He said, "Mom says you've been limping for weeks." I said, "Your mother talks too much." He laughed. I laughed, and then we were driving and the rain started, and it was coming down so hard that he slowed down and turned the wipers to their fastest setting. And we sat there in the noise of it, and he wasn't in any hurry to get me home, and I wasn't in any hurry to get there, he said, you know? I always liked your house better than ours when I was a kid, I said. Why, he said, because yours was the house where people actually talked to each other at our house. Everybody was always busy. Dad was at the plant and Mom was running around and my brothers were off doing their things. But at your house, it felt like things slowed down, like you could sit in the kitchen and just be there. I looked at him. He was watching the road, his hands on the wheel, his profile against the gray light from the rain. And I felt something I am still ashamed to name. My felt seen, not noticed. Neil notices me. Neil notices when I've changed my hair, or when I've cleaned the kitchen, or when I've put out the good plates. He notices in the way a person notices the furniture has been rearranged. A glance, an acknowledgement moving on. Theo saw me. The way he said it, your house, was the house where people actually talked to each other. He had been paying attention to my life for years. He had been carrying a feeling about my home and my kitchen and my way of being in a room, and he had kept it, and he had given it back to me in one sentence. On a rainy Thursday in his truck, we pulled up to my house and the rain was still coming down, and he said, "Do you want me to walk you to the door?" I said, "I think I can manage." He said, "I know you can manage. That's not what I asked." I sat with that for a moment. That's not what I asked. Such a small thing to say. Such a small correction. But it landed in my chest like a stone dropped into that still pond I was telling you about, and the ripples went out. And they haven't stopped. Said, "Thank you for the ride, Theo." He said anytime, and he meant it. I could tell he meant it the way some people mean things with their whole body, not just their mouth. I went inside and I stood in my kitchen and I listened to the rain on the windows. And I put the kettle on and I stood there and I thought about how no one has asked me if they could walk me to my own front door in probably 20 years. Neil was in the den, the television was on some game. He didn't look up when I came in. He said, "How's the knee?" I said, "Fine." He said, "Good." That was it. That was the whole conversation. I made tea and I sat at the kitchen table and I held the mug in both hands and I thought about Theo's hands on the steering wheel, and I told myself to stop. I told myself to stop, and I did not stop. 2 weeks later, I was at Marisol's for the women's group. Tuesday evening, we were doing the usual things. Wine, cheese, a devotion from a book Marisol had ordered from the church bookstore after the meeting ended. And the other women left. I stayed behind to help clean up, because that's what I do. I clean up, I wash other people's dishes, I wipe their counters. It gives me something to do with my hands. Theo came in through the back door. He lived in a small apartment over the garage at his parents' house. He'd been saving for a place of his own. He came in and he said, "Oh, sorry. I didn't know anyone was still here." And Marisol said, "We're finished. Come have a glass of wine." And he sat down at the table. And Marisol went upstairs to get something, and it was just the two of us for maybe 4 minutes. 4 minutes. He said, "How's the knee?" I said, "Better not." True. He said, "Are you happy?" I looked at him. He was pouring himself wine, and he wasn't looking at me. When he said it the way you'd ask someone about the weather. Casual, open, like happiness was a thing you could just check on, like it was a tire pressure or a prescription refill, something that needed monitoring. I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "I mean, are you happy? Not are you fine, not are you okay, are you happy? Because there's a difference, and I think you know the difference, and I think nobody asks you, the real versionary." All came back. The moment ended. I went home. Neil was asleep. In the chair, I turned off the television. I covered him with the blanket from the back of the couch. I went to bed. "Are you happy?" I lay in the dark, and I felt the question sitting on my chest like a cat that has chosen you, heavy and warm and refusing to move. The next time I saw him was at the parish potluck in November. I was standing near the dessert table, arranging the brownies I'd brought on a paper plate, and he appeared beside me, and he said, "Those look dangerous." And I said, "They're from a box." And he said, "I don't believe you." And I said, "It's the truth." And he said, "You're the kind of woman who says things are from a box, so people won't expect too much, and then they taste it, and they're overwhelmed." I didn't say anything to that. I picked up a brownie and I put it on his plate, and I said, "Eat." and find out he ate it. He closed his eyes for a second. He said, "Yeah, that's not from a box and." We stood there at the dessert table in the parish hall with the fluorescent lights and the folding chairs and the kids running around and Father Morrison doing his rounds, and I felt more alive than I had felt in years. Not because of him, because of me, because something in me that had been asleep was waking up, and it was terrifying, and it was exhilarating, and it was wrong. It was wrong because I was a married woman standing in a church hall feeling awake because a younger man ate my brownie and told me I was the kind of person who hides her gifts. After that, things happened in small ways, the way things do, not dramatic, not loud, small. He came by the house once to drop off a flyer for the winter concert at the middle school where he teaches. Neil was at work. He came in because I offered him coffee, and he sat at my kitchen table, and we talked for 40 minutes. He told me about his students, a girl named Destiny who couldn't afford a violin, and he found her one in a thrift shop and brought it in, and she cried. He told me about a boy named Marcus who was angry at everything, and Theo gave him a pair of drumsticks and said, "Hit something that means something." And Marcus looked at him and said, "What does that even mean?" And Theo said, "I don't know yet, let's figure it out together." He told me these things, and I listened, and I thought, this is a person who is paying attention to the world. This is a person who walks into a room and asks what matters here, and then tries to do that thing. And I thought, my husband has not asked me a question that wasn't logistical in 10 years. What time will you be home? Do we need milk? Did you call the insurance company? Did you remember to lock the garage? Those are not questions, those are status checks. Theo asked me what I was reading. I said I'd started reading poetry again for the first time since college. He asked me which poets, and I said Mary Oliver, and he said, "Does she still teach you things?" And I said, "She teaches me to pay attention." And he said, "That's the hardest thing in the world to do." And I said, "I know." And we looked at each other across the kitchen table, and neither of us looked away for a long time, and then he said, "I should go on." He went hand. I stood at the kitchen sink and I washed his coffee cup and I held it under the water longer than I needed. December came. I saw him at the concert. He was directing the middle school orchestra, and he was up on the stage, and he was so young and so earnest, and his students adored him, and I could see it in the way they watched him, they trusted him, they leaned toward him when he spoke. He made them feel like what they were doing mattered, and I sat in the audience and I thought, I understand those children completely. After the concert, he found me in the lobby. He was still wearing the tie he'd put on for the performance, and his hair was messed up from running his hands through it, which he does when he's nervous, and I've seen him do it since he was 12. He said, "Thank you for coming." I said, "Of course." He said, "It means something that you came." I said, "It's a school concert, Theo, not a Broadway premiere." He said, "No. I mean, it means something that you came because you didn't have to, and you came anyway, and that's the kind of thing I notice about you. You show up for people, you always have." Neil was in the car waiting. I went out, Neil said. "Was that the Donovan kid?" I said, "Yes." Neil said, "He looks young to be a teacher." I said, "He's good at it." Neil said, and pulled out of the parking lot. And that was that. In January, I was walking at the reservoir. I walk there most mornings. It's a 3-mile loop, and I've been doing it since the doctor told me I needed to move more for my blood pressure. And at first I hated it, and then I loved it, and now it's the only 30 minutes of the day that belonged to MIT. Was a cold morning, mid-30s. The kind of cold that's sharp but not brutal if you keep moving. I was about halfway around the loop when I saw him coming the other direction, Theo running. He slowed when he saw me. He stopped. He said, "I didn't know you walked here." I said, "Every morning, rain or shine." He said, "I just started running here last week. I've been driving 20 minutes to a track, and it's boring, and I thought the reservoir would be better, and it is." We fell into step. We walked together. He was in running clothes, and his breath was visible in the cold, and his cheeks were red, and he looked younger than ever, and I was in my old green coat, with the broken zipper, and my walking shoes, and I felt every one of my 58 years. We walked, and we talked, and at one point he said, "Can I ask you something?" And my heart did. Something it hasn't done since I was a girl. It flipped, actually physically flipped in my chest. I said, what? He said, that day at my mother's house, when I asked you if you were happy, you never answered. May said, I know, he said. Are you going to answer me now? The reservoir was gray and still, and there were geese on the far shore, and the path was empty, and the sky was the color of pewter, and I could hear my own breathing and his breathing, and the scratch of our shoes on the gravel, and I said, I don't know how to answer that question. He said, that's an answer. Said, no, it isn't. Said, it means you've been thinking about it, and if you've been thinking about it, then the question did its job. I said, what job is that? He said, to wake you up. We stopped walking. We were standing near the bench at the halfway point, the bench where I usually sit for 2 minutes. To catch my breath before continuing, he was close, not too close. Close enough that I could see the scar above his left eyebrow from when he fell off my son's bike at age 9. Close enough that I could see that his eyes were brown with a ring of green near the pupil, and that they were looking at me with something I hadn't been looked at with in a very long time. Desire something before, desire something more dangerous than desire, tensionful, unbroken attention, the kind that says, I am here with you, and I am not checking my phone, and I am not thinking about what's next, and I am not waiting for this to be over. I am here with you right now. He said, I'm not going to do anything. I want you to know that I'm not going to do anything. Because you're married, and because I've known you my whole life, and because I respect you, and because this isn't that. Ty said then, what is this? He said. I think this is me noticing that you're a person who stopped being noticed, and I think that's a crime, and I think whoever is responsible for that should be ashamed. I said, Theo. He said, I know, I'm not supposed to say things like that. Said, no. You're no. Said, I'm sorry. Said, don't be sorry, just be careful. He said, I'm not the one who needs to be careful. And then he stepped back and he put his hands in the pockets of his jacket and he said, I'll see you around, Mrs. Caldera. And I said, don't call me that. And he said, Elena. And I said, yes. And he said, good morning, Elena. And he started running again, and he passed me, and I stood there on the path by the bench, and the geese were calling, and the cold was getting into my coat, and I realized I was crying, not sobbing, not breaking down, just tears, quiet tears on a cold morning, walking alone on a path I've walked 1,000 times because a man 30 years younger than me told me I deserved to be noticed, and the worst part is he was right. I did deserve to be noticed. And I had stopped noticing myself so long ago that I didn't even know I was missing. I went home. Neil was eating cereal. He said, you were out long. I said, I walked slower today. He said, it's cold for walking. I said, I know. He said, you should get a treadmill. I said, maybe. I went upstairs and I took a shower and I stood under the water and I thought about what I wanted, and I was honest with myself. For the first time in maybe decades, and here is what I wanted. I did not want Theo, not the way you're thinking. I did not want to leave Neil. I did not want an affair. I did not want to blow up my life or his life or anyone's life. I wanted to be asked if I was happy, and I wanted to answer honestly. And I wanted the answer to matter to someone. That's all. That's the whole thing. That's the crime and the confession. And the mistake all wrapped up together. I wanted someone to care whether I was happy, and to say it out loud, and to look at me while they waited for the answer. I called Theo that afternoon. I don't know why I did it that way instead of waiting to see him. I think I needed to do it before I lost my nerve. I said, Theo, it's Elena. He said, I know your voice. I said, I need to say something and I need you to hear it. He said, okay. I said, I think you're a remarkable person, and I think the world is better because you're in it, and I think what you said to me this morning was kind and true, and I am grateful for it, but I can't do this. I can't have a person in my life who sees me more clearly than my husband does, because it will break something that I'm not ready to have broken, not because of you, because of me, because if I keep being seen, I'm going to have to look at things in my life that I've been very comfortable not looking at, and I'm not ready. He was quiet for a while, then he said, that's the bravest thing I've ever heard anyone say. I said, it doesn't feel brave. It feels like hiding. He said maybe those are the same things sometimes. I said, maybe. He said, Elena. I said, yes. He said, can I ask you one more question? I said, okay. He said, are you going to do anything about it? Not about me? About the thing you're not looking at? I said, I don't know. He said, that's okay. Not knowing is better than pretending. You Dow hung up. I sat in the kitchen for a long time. The light changed. Afternoon became evening. Neil came home. I made dinner. We ate. He watched television. I sat beside him on the couch, which I don't usually do. I usually sit in the kitchen with a book, but that night I sat beside him and he looked at me and he said, you okay? And I said, I'm thinking about some things. And he said, like what? And I said, like whether I'm happy. And he said, why would you ask that? And I said, because someone asked me and I couldn't answer, and it bothered me. He muted the television. He looked at me. He said, who asked you? That Ty said, a friend. He said, which friend? Ty said, does it matter? He said, I guess not. Are you unhappy? I said, I don't know. I think I might be somewhere in between. I think I might have been in between for a long time and I just got used to. I've sat with that. He's not a stupid man. He's not unkind. He's just been asleep the way I've been asleep. He said, what do you want to do about it? I said, I want to talk more. I want us to talk the way we used to. I want to know what you're thinking, and I want you to know what I'm thinking, and I don't want us to be two people who share an address and a grocery list and nothing else. He said, that's a lot. He said, I know. I'm not asking for tomorrow. I'm asking for a start. He said, okay, we can start. He unmuted the television. We sat there. He reached over and he took my hand, which he hasn't done in years, and he held it in his lap, and we watched the rest of whatever was on, and I didn't cry this time. I just breathed. That was 4 months ago. Have things changed? Yes and no. Neil and I have had some conversations, not as many as I'd like. Some of them have been good, and some of them have been stilted and awkward, like two people learning a language they used to be fluent in. He asked me what I was reading, and I told him, and he actually listened. I asked him what he was thinking about, and he said he was worried about retirement and what he would do with himself, and I said I was worried about the same thing, and we sat with that together, and it was the most intimate moment we'd had in years, and it was just two people in a kitchen saying, I'm scared about getting older. Haven't seen Theo since that phone call. I still walk the reservoir every morning. Sometimes I think I see his truck in the parking lot, but it's never his. He teaches his students. He lives his life. He is 23 years younger than me, and he asked me a question that my husband never asked me, and the question cracked something open, and I chose to walk toward my marriage instead of away from it. And I don't know if that was the right choice, or the safe choice, or if there's even a difference. Think about him sometimes, not with longing, not with what if. I think about him the way you think about a person who handed you a flashlight in a dark room. They didn't build the room, they didn't lock you in, they just showed you where the walls were so you could find the door yourself. The question still echoes, are you happy? Are you happy? Are you happy? I'm closer to an answer than I was. I'm not there yet. But I'm asking myself now, and I think that's where it has to start. Not with someone else asking, with you asking yourself, and being willing to hear the answer, even if the answer is I don't know, and being willing to sit with that I don't know until it becomes something true. So please don't make the same mistake I did. Don't wait 30 years for someone to notice you're alive. Notice yourself first. Ask yourself the question before someone else has to. And if you're lucky enough to be asked by someone who genuinely wants to know the answer, don't run from it, and don't chase it either. Just stand still, just breathe, just let it crack you open enough to see what's inside. That's where the life is, inside the crack, in the space between fine and happy. In the place where you stop pretending and start telling the truthium. Still learning how to live there. I'm not good at it yet, but I'm there, and for now, that's enough.